The horror fiction genre can be traced back to the 18th century and has been a theme for books and novels since then. In the late 1890s, Georges Méliès made what was credited as the first horror film, Le Manoir de Diable, or The Devil's Castle, which was a short film spanning around 3 minutes.
Later in the early 20th century, a lot of film adaptations of books began popping up. Titles like Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Frankenstein were among the most popular.
However, with the introduction to home consoles, a new medium for conveying art and expressions to a user, there would not go long before the horror genre would also be implemented for this medium. For example, Friday the 13th for the Atari 2600. Although there were not a big market for horror games back then,
in 1996 that would all change.
Capcom released the first survival horror game under the name Resident Evil for the PS1. It instantly became not only a cult classic but the grandfather of survival horror, with its tank controls, limited ammo and health, puzzles and creepy atmosphere. Since then, many developers started to make horror games, and the popularity of horror games have really taken off. Games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Outlast, Slender the Eight Pages and Five Nights at Freddy's have gained massive popularity by being extremely scary, and with the introduction to virtual reality systems, horror games have supposedly been taken to a whole new level. But how do one measure how scared people are when playing a horror game? This project aims to investigate if it is possible to measure fear when playing a horror game. By using an Arduino, we have made a device that can measure the heart rate using a pulse sensor and the electrodermal activity using electrodes. But before we got to any testing, it is important to state what the term fear will include in this project. When one feels fear, there are a lot of psychological reactions happening in the body. Certain chemicals are released, there are muscle tension, hyperventilation, and etc. Since our Arduino can only measure GSR and HRV, the way we categorize fear in this project is with the GSR, the HRV, the test participant statements, and the oral and bodily reactions. First, we want to test to see if there are any difference when comparing virtual reality to a regular monitor. We had 15 participants using VR and 15 using a regular monitor to play the game affected the horror experience. And the results were quite clear on the GSR, which means that there was an increase in arousal. We choose to believe this was not due to sexual arousal, but instead elevation in stress. It can be seen that there definitely is a statistical difference in the GSR between the two groups. The participants using the Oculus Rift had a much higher GSR compared to the baseline. It had a p-value of 0.01025. We can also see a weak correlation between how scared the participants felt and the GSR with an R-value of 0.24. Unfortunately, the HRV did not measure correctly and that data cannot be used. Using the data from the GSR, we decided to use the Oculus Rift as the visual interaction medium and setup for the next test, where we wanted to see if there are measurable differences in GSR and HRV between using headphones and speakers when playing a horror game. Setting up the next test, we replaced the mouse and keyboard with a handheld controller due to requests from participants in the first test. 15 people played with headphones and 15 played with speakers. However, as can be seen on the data, there are not any statistical significance between the two on either the HRV or GSR. Furthermore, this is backed up by the statements by the participants. From that, we can conclude that for this small sample, playing a horror game using headphones or speakers provided roughly the same experience. We do, however, see that there is a weak correlation between how much people enjoy horror games in general and their GSR and HRV, although this correlation is only weak or negligible. Overall, we could measure that people got more aroused when using VR and playing a horror game. However, there are no significant difference in measurements when playing with a headset or speakers. Thank you for watching our AV production.